All right, friends, let's talk about making the bird in the air block, which is number 2 block in the construction guide. It's made up of one large triangle, a small 4.5-inch HST, and then these 2 individual triangles. Okay, so the first thing, this one I've cut from a whole square. So I cut out a square that was 9 inches by 9 inches, sliced it diagonally, set aside 1/2, and this is the other half. All right. Then I made an HST starting with 5 inches, 2 5-inch squares. I ended up making 2 of these. Here's the extra here, but I'm not using it for this, so I'm setting it aside, right? So you start with a 5-inch square on top of another 5-inch square. You do your 2 at a time HST, right? Set that one aside, open this up. So now this now measures 4.5 inches. All right. And then for these 2 triangles, they start out, I like to cut these exact for the size of this block. So I cut these at 4, I cut a square that is 4 7/8 of an inch. You could cut 5 inch all the way around, but I like to try and make it exact. So this is 4 7/8 of an inch. All right, so construction for this block is actually pretty straightforward. You start with your half square triangle, and you're going to add on, I like to call these 2 the wings. You're going to add the wings on 1 at a time. So let's start with this one here. When I'm adding these 2 together, I want this to be lined up. So when I fold this over, this side is going to be lined up, and I'll be stitching along here, and you'll see there's a little tail sticking out here, and that's fine. That's your little dog ear. All right, we're just going to add some pins. We'll sew 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then we'll press it towards this piece. Okay, I have the first wing on here, and now I'm going to add this wing on. So again, this line should be lined up, and along here lined up. Put in my pins, and I'm going to stitch. I'm going to stitch right across here, and if you want, you can also trim off that previous dog ear. There we go, so it doesn't get caught under your presser foot. Okay, so 1/4 inch seam here, and then the same, we're going to, okay, now we have the other one on. You can see I've ironed the seams towards these 2 outer wings. I'm just going to trim this dog ear off like this. Okay, and so now you'll see there's, your point should be here, and you should have this overlap right here, because this becomes your seam allowance, gets buried in it when we add it to this one. So here's how we do this. This is the key to this block, because I think the biggest challenge for this is not losing that nice center point. So we're going to put this down like this, and line it up like this. Now you're going to see I cut this half. I cut this at 9 inches. If I'd have cut it at 8 7/8 of an inch, I wouldn't have this little extra bit hanging over, but that's okay. I can trim it up after I put these 2 halves together. So I'm going to go like this. When I'm stitching, I want to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I want to hit this, see where the seams cross? I don't want to go over on this side. I'll lose my point, so I want to try and hit what I like to call X marks the spot. So I just keep an eye on it as I'm stitching and make sure that I don't cross that X. All right, so I'll add some pins, and then I'll stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance as usual. And then when I've got those two halves together, I'll iron the seam towards this solid, okay? All right, I have the two halves together. You can see I managed to keep that center point. And now I want to measure this and just make sure it's 8.5 inches. And if it's a little large, I'll just trim this side a little bit because this was the side that was a little bigger than this bottom piece here. So I'm going to take my big ruler, 8.5 inches, and then I'm just going to trim those two sides here and here. All right, so now I've got a nice finished 8.5 inch bird in the air block, and that's block number 2 in the construction guide. Okay.